Welcome, everyone, and thank you for all who've introduced yourselves in the chat. Okay, and thank y'all for being here. Was there anything in particular that anybody came here with that you're like, I want to make sure we talk about this that you didn't share in chat or haven't had a chance to say yet? All right, well, welcome, welcome. And I don't know if everybody had a chance to look at this, but we actually did a blog last week. And any of you who have been on these know that I'm very sincere in wanting to share information, but sometimes get confused about sharing my screen. So we're going to look at, and this is a blog we did last week, Families as Allies did, on this hearing on youth residential treatment facilities and the opportunity to share feedback. But I just want to, there's all different perspectives on this, and I just want to give y'all a chance because this is supposed to be a discussion, not just me talking. Do y'all have any thoughts about what you see just from your standpoint now, the strengths and weaknesses of residential treatment facilities and what we're talking about? And in Mississippi, we typically call them psychiatric residential treatment facilities. This report refers to them as residential treatment facilities. So that would be places like CARES, youth villages in Memphis. I'm going to leave some out. I think Alliance has one, Diamond Grove, Mill Creek, those kinds of places. So any thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses or opportunities, challenges that any of y'all have? Any thoughts? I feel like I can make people be quiet just by asking a question. All right, I'll just share a little from the perspective of families as allies and how we tend to end up interacting with families who are thinking about some of these facilities, or maybe their child's already there or is getting out. We're a statewide organization run by and for families of children with behavioral health challenges, behavioral health and related challenges. So we support each other and work together to try to make things better for our children. So that means if a family calls us, and y'all probably know this, our core beliefs about families, or we think they know their child better than anyone, they're their strongest advocate. And we think systems should go by laws and policies about families and children's rights. So we're going to support them in getting what they want for their child. So a lot of times when a family calls us about a psychiatric residential treatment facility, they're calling because they feel like they're at the end of their rope, and that's the only thing that's going to help. So when we're supporting families, I want to show y'all something else. This is also on our website. And I hope if you haven't been to our website before, you'll go and look. And this is a section that I hope all the sections are helpful, but this one under resources, helpful websites and documents has a lot of different kinds of information. And everything we do, or at least we hope this is true, is based on the definition of family-driven practice. And this is the nationally accepted definition of family-driven practice. So this is what we're going to be thinking about if a family comes to us and is saying, I don't know what else to do. I think my child needs to go somewhere. So family-driven means families, not anybody else, has the primary role in decisions regarding their child, their children, as well as the policies and procedures governing the well-being of all children in their community, state, tribe, territory, and nation. So this includes, but it's not limited to, so this means for any child, but then also families working together to establish policy, identifying the strengths, challenges, desired outcomes and goals, and steps needed to achieve these goals. designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating services, supports, programs, and systems, choosing support services and providers who are culturally and linguistically responsive and aware, and partnering in decision making at all levels. So, and then the first guiding value under this is families and youth share and have access to accurate, understandable, and complete information necessary to set goals and make informed decisions. So, from the standpoint, well, I'll just ask you guys. Let's just say you were the executive director of Families as Allies, and you're thinking about that family who walks through the door and they're saying, this is what I want, and I know my child better than anyone, and I'm considering psychiatric residential treatment facility. And I told you all the things we believe about families. And then I'm looking at this definition of family-driven practice, and there's lots of values that go with it. But I think for this discussion, one of the most important ones is this first one, is that families and youth share and have access to accurate, understandable, and complete information necessary to set goals and to make informed decisions. Any thoughts about what you, just looking at all this, might be how you might approach a family who's saying, if you're us and a family is saying, I think I might want my child to go somewhere. Any thoughts in light of all this? Y'all can also tell me if I'm talking too much and not making sense. Well, one thing we're thinking about is we definitely want to support that family in whatever they want for their child. Because again, they know their child better than anyone. They're their strongest advocate. It's not up to us to talk them into or out of something. At the same time, I'll tell you what I'm thinking as the executive director of Families as Allies. Okay, families should have access to accurate, understandable, and complete information necessary to set goals and make informed decisions. So, what I'm thinking and what our organization is thinking when a report like this comes out, I'll go back to this report, is okay, is there anything in this report that is accurate information that families need to know that's going to help them have accurate and complete information to make a decision that they are trying to make about their child? So we always want to assess anything like this that comes out, is this accurate? Is it informative? Is this going to be something that will help a family make a decision? Now, I'm not going to try to talk them into what decision that should be, but to make sure that they have all the information they need to make that decision. So that's one thing we're thinking about when something like this comes out. So any thoughts or questions about that?
I don't have any questions.
Thank you. And let me know, y'all can tell me if we're staying on the right track. So this information actually had two parts. One was this big report that came out. And are y'all seeing where it says warehouses of neglect? Okay, so this is this big report that came out, Warehouses of Neglect, How Taxpayers Are Funding Systemic Abuse in Youth Residential Treatment Facilities. So, and it's a Senate Committee on Finance. So it's one committee of the United States Senate. So this is in Washington, D.C. This is about the whole country. Sometimes when we talk about the Senate, we're talking about the Mississippi Senate, but this is the United States Senate. So this committee did this study, and they looked at a lot of documents from 4 different big providers of residential treatment facilities: Universal Health Services, Acadia, Devereaux, and Vivant. Now, 2 of those, Universal and Acadia, have facilities in Mississippi, and we've got that in the blog if you want to look at what those are. One thing, okay, and a lot of what they did was go through records, records from these facilities. So you can see 25,000 pages of company productions, and then they had dozens of conversations with different stakeholders, and they visited RTFs on the ground. Now, I may have just overlooked this, and I don't know if anybody on here knows this. One thing we wanted to find out is, well, did you come to Mississippi? Because, what's going on in Mississippi, we don't know if that's the same as what's going on everywhere else. As far as we could tell, that isn't specified anywhere in this document. Now, I may have missed something obvious, or I may have missed something in a footnote. Does anybody know if there was actually like visits to Mississippi or anything like that? I'm thinking we don't know.
This is Gemma Smith. I'm with Mill Creek. As far as I know, we did not have anyone come to any of our facilities.
Okay.
We have, years in the past, and evidently, they didn't really find anything. But no, not in the last 3, 4, 5 years.
Okay.
They focused a lot on Arkansas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it did look that way. And then in the testimony, you see that. Okay. So, but there was a lot of pages of documents reviewed, so that, who knows, that may have been some from Mississippi, but that is something we don't know.
Most of the I know they reviewed some documents, and they were the Joint Commission.
Oh, okay.
Reviews and suggestions from Mississippi. So I think that's really all they went by for Mississippi was the
okay. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So let's see. So then we're going to look at some of their key findings, but I want to back up a little bit, and I just want you all to think, and I'm glad we have everyone on here, including residential treatment providers, because we need everybody at the table to really honestly, and I'm not saying anyone's not being honest, but we need to have, I hate that term, safe spaces, but we need to have places where everyone can be at the table. And I don't know if we have any family members on here, but we really need them at the table, and youth have been in these facilities to really reflect on this and see what we need to do with it. But this is one thing we also think a lot about at Families as Allies, and probably everybody on here has thought about this too at some level. But when you think about it, one of the biggest things we see, and some of us have felt with our own children, is when your child is having a lot of challenges, especially if it's disrupting other children or the home, things at home, and if you have other children that you're worried about their safety, like if it's an older child and they're aggressive, and then you have younger ones at home and that type of thing, there is this absolute longing for something that will make it better, because it's just such a hard thing to live with. And the solution cannot be, okay, well, we're not going to use residential treatment facilities. It's just up, that family's just going to have to figure something out. That's not going to work. So we would never imply that. But that is often, families are coming to these situations just with angst and feeling like they've tried everything. They may have tried all that stuff like MyPack, different programs, and it's just for them, it's not working. So there's a desperation and a longing, and that just makes sense, because they're up against incredibly difficult odds. And we don't ever want to minimize that as families as allies. And we are there for them and with them to advocate for what they want. Okay, so there's that feeling and that longing for that place that will make everything better or will make it tolerable or will improve things. And when you think about it, like if I went off somewhere for, like to get specially trained in some job skill for 4 weeks to 6 months, you would think when I'd come back that I would know that job skill better. So I think there's that feeling about residential treatment facilities too. But, and I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes here, the flip side of that is this. I want everyone, and I want you to imagine, and of course, no one has perfect mental health, but I want you to imagine a child who's functioning well, like just some child who you were thinking, if I was going to describe a child who's had pretty good mental health, that's who I would describe. Has everybody got someone in mind? You don't have to say who it is. Y'all are a quiet group. Everybody got someone in your brain you're thinking of? Okay. Now I want you to imagine, and I don't know who this child is living with, but I'm assuming they are living with whoever their family is. Might be, their mom and dad, it might be their grandma, it might be someone else, but they're living with them, probably going to school well, not right at the moment, but during the school year, probably going to school somewhere. And probably has some friends, probably has some stuff in the community they like to do. Now, I want you to imagine, and I'm not saying my child's the most mentally healthy, and he's kind of beyond being a child because he just turned 24, but I'm going to use him as an example. Now, just in my head. Now, just imagine we take that same child and we say, okay, we're going to take you, and instead of living with whoever your family is, whoever that is, we're going to take you and put you in this place where you don't know people, and there will be people who will take care of you, but they're not your family. It's going to be these other people you're around 24/7. Now, I just want you to imagine that child. Do you think that would change anything for that child inside of them?
I believe they would be scared.
Yeah, probably be scared, not know what's going on. And then now, and I realize that some children are often not coming from the type of setting or may not be coming from the setting I'm describing. Okay, let's just say we do that, and then not going to go to the school that you normally go to, and you may not even go to school as you're used to going to it, like a place somewhere. It may be in the same place that you haven't been to before. And you're going to be around other kids, but not necessarily the kids you're used to being around, and the things you normally do, you're probably not going to do them. And somebody else is going to decide your schedule. For the most part, you'll have some input. And you'll probably have some input into what you eat, but maybe not a whole lot. Now, just imagine that child you're thinking of. If we did those things, do you think that would help or be challenging for their mental health? Any thoughts?
I would say definitely challenging, especially if you're considering in this aspect, the kids that you're around are also there because of emotional or behavioral issues. And so you're getting triggered by other people's behaviors. You can't control how loud it is. You don't always have a quiet, private space, even to process any of these feelings that you may be having, especially as soon as you come in. You haven't had a designated safe person yet.
So some good points. So a lot going on. Was somebody else getting ready to say something? Sometimes the little lights I'm seeing just kind of wiggle, and I don't know if it's because you guys are getting ready to say something. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot to think about. Now, I do know, there are children, and one big problem we have in this state that is a failure on the part of the state. I'm not blaming this on the children or their families at all. Is, like with CPS, they have a lot of children who do not have placement. And one thing that this report talks about is these facilities being used more as placement than an actual treatment. So, there are children, from what I understand, who instead of like staying in a hotel are ending up in one of these facilities. And yeah, this might be better than staying in a hotel with a stranger, but it doesn't mean it's ideal. And what we need to think about is, however some of these issues are addressed, what is it? What is the best thing for any child's mental health? And let's strive to create that. So children being able to have those things that all children have in the community, that's the ideal. Okay. So, on this report, and you can go back, our blog has the link to actually listen to the testimony, and it's got the written testimony of the witnesses, and one was Elizabeth Manley, who a lot of us here know, and she's an expert on system of care approaches from New Jersey, person from Arkansas who runs their disability rights organization, who has done a lot of investigation in that state, and then another person who's from a federal agency. And what was interesting to me, I thought it would just be hearing those people, which would be helpful in addition to, but that they would just be saying that, their written testimony, which was also submitted. But there's a lot of really interesting questions and answers after, and I think it's close to 2 hours, but it's well worth listening to. Okay, so both from that report and then from this hearing, and there were a lot of youth that submitted comments in this hearing too, from what they had experienced in different facilities. These were the key findings that came out of this. And basically, this first one is about oversight, that Congress needs to legislate to improve the conditions in residential treatment facilities and the broader behavioral health landscape. So there hasn't been a lot of attention to this. And that is one thing that a theme that comes up over and over is, where is the oversight of these facilities? And let's just look at Mississippi. Does anybody know, like, who in Mississippi has authority over these facilities to look at things? Like, who licenses and all that?
So we
Yeah.
are licensed by Joint Commission and Mississippi Department of Education, Department of Health. CPS has jurisdiction over our group homes as well.
So yeah, so in the state licensing authority is typically the Department of Health, for these facilities, and then the education services are overseen through MDE, and then and I saw there's some people on here from Medicaid. So, and Medicaid,
Right, and Department of Medicaid.
yeah, pays for, the Division of Medicaid pays for, I think, the actual stay and services, not the education services. So that would give them the authority to look at, are they getting what they are paid for? And I think I understood and y'all from Medicaid can tell me this, that right now, I don't think there's a routine process. And I don't know if there is with the Department of Health either, like a routine monitoring process with Medicaid, or if it's more like if something happens, if something's brought to the attention of Medicaid, they go look.
There is a routine, as far as Medicaid. But also, we, if anything happens, they come in too. That's Department of Health, CPS, Medicaid.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. And then you brought up the Joint Commission, which is an outside entity that sets standards that a facility like a hospital or residential treatment facility has to meet to get that certification. So that does mean that families, like if they're concerned about something, have the option of notifying the Department of Health, and that's one thing we're always happy to help families do, the Division of Medicaid. If it's about school services, education, they can contact the Joint Commission, because the Joint Commission has standards. You can look at the standards, and if you feel one of those is violated, let them know. Another group, and this isn't emphasized in Mississippi as much as it is in other states. Every state has a designated protection and advocacy agency. And in our state, now this is a federally mandated, this is a federal law. Every state has to have a protection and advocacy agency that protects, that's their sole purpose. They don't do other things. So to protect the rights of people with disabilities, and particularly when they're in any kind of institutional care. So if they're in jail, if they're in a treatment facility, because people who are in facilities are more vulnerable. And in our state, that's Disability Rights Mississippi. So anybody can call them, including the people who are in the facility, if they feel like their rights are being violated. So, and their sole purpose is to protect the rights of people with disabilities, including in institutions. And they're the only non-state entity that has the right to like go into a facility unannounced and see what's going on. Like if somebody called us, I couldn't just, let's say they called us, I think someone's on here from Mill Creek. Let's just say someone called me about Mill Creek. I could try to help them figure out what was going on, but I just can't come down to your facility and say, we got this call, I need to investigate this, because that's not my role, but that is their role. And I don't think that's always really well understood. So that's one support families have. Okay. Then it talks about children suffer routine harm inside of residential treatment facilities, including sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and inadequate provision of behavioral health treatment. That does not mean that every child who goes into a facility is going to experience these things. They are saying that they saw evidence that these things were fairly routine, that they happened pretty frequently. Any thoughts about that? I'm not sure she's still on here. Someone was saying in the beginning. Oh, and I see there is someone from Disability Rights on here, I think. Did I explain that right? You're from Jane, you're from Disability Rights, right? She may have stepped away. Someone was saying earlier, children are around, other children who have challenges. That can increase the likelihood of abuse. Also, just there is something about putting a lot of people with challenges together, even if it doesn't have to be a whole lot, that it creates a more challenging environment. It creates more challenges for the staff, as opposed to if that child is treated in like a smaller, more home-like setting, is typically safer. And also, if they're in a much smaller setting that's home-like, it's more likely that other people will notice if something's going on and report it and intervene. So there is something that is just challenging about the nature of having that many children together and all of the staff experiencing it's hard to work with, that many children who are all having challenges, and it's absolutely the staff's job to keep them safe, but it just creates more risk. And I know and a lot of you already know this, I'm a psychologist by training, and I'm not working clinically right now, but I did for a number of years. And when I moved to Mississippi, my husband and I, and this was back in the 90s, one of the first things I did, I started working with Catholic Charities, and Henry and I worked on this together. We started Hope Haven, which was a small crisis center with 5 to 7 beds. And we even found there, I think the staff did pretty well with it, But children, youth learn from other youth. If you put youth together and youth are naturally going to be influenced by their peers because that's how they're programmed, and that's actually developmentally healthy. You're increasing the risk of harm because those youth are going to learn things from each other, like running away and things like that. So, and that kind of goes with this, that the risk of harm to children in residential treatment facilities is endemic to the operating model. So that just means it just is part of the nature of that model. So that's a huge thing to think about and look at as far as how could that be addressed and what other kinds of models might not have that challenge. Now, this takes it a step further, and it says that providers are incentivized to optimize revenues and operating profit margins. So that's just bringing up that there is, if you are operating this and it's a business, and if you're going to make money, that one way to do that is to have the least number of staff you can have with the most number of children and still, be within all the guidelines and stuff. But that incentive to make money creates a situation where children might not be as well protected. Children inside residential treatment facilities often do not get the treatment they need for mental and behavioral health needs, despite residential treatment facilities being reimbursed to provide these intensive services. It does, and I think all of us kind of feel this way, that it just intuitively makes sense that if a child goes somewhere where they're 24/7, that they're going to get a lot of therapeutic services. But and they may at some places, and some children may. We're not saying this applies to every child who's ever gone to a residential treatment facility. But what this report found is that there was a lot of time just kind of sitting. And that it wasn't necessarily that they were getting any more treatment services than they would if they were outside the facility. And I think this may go more to that idea of sometimes children are there and the primary purpose it's serving either because there isn't a place for them to stay or because it has become very hard because the right kinds of supports aren't available for them to stay either in their own home or another kind of home-like setting. That doesn't exist. The right supports don't exist, or there's not enough of them, or the right kind of setting. So they end up there basically because they need a place to stay, and that's interpreted as being treatment, but that's not really treatment if you look at what actually happens when they go there. Horrific instances of sexual abuse persist unremediated inside residential treatment facilities. So they did see a lot of evidence of that. And when you think about it, it does create a setting where adults have a lot more access to children. So that's a very scary thing to think about. And then restraint and seclusion allows for what they called unchecked abuse, so that's happening and nothing is being done. And then that RTFs have ignored federal restraint and seclusion regulations, resulting in rates of restraint and seclusion that exceed each intervention occurring daily. So that basically means from the records they looked at, there was more episodes of restraint than actually people implementing the treatment that was supposed to be. And that residential treatment facilities often employ unqualified or inadequately trained staff, and that staff routinely fail to discharge their duties. And that is challenging. It's very challenging. It's very challenging to find employees, and finding employees who are willing to work in 24/7 facilities and show up and do what needs to be done. That's very challenging. And looking at models like, could the support be developed another way to meet the real need that's there that wouldn't require that? Residential treatment facility staffing failures have led to tragic incidents, including child fatalities and children's repeated exposure to risk. So, and they describe some of those. So like a child eloped and that wasn't even discovered. And by the time they discovered the child had eloped, he'd already been struck by a truck. And when they went back and looked, there was lots of incidents. And this kind of work is very, very hard, I know. Because like, we did Hope Haven, and that was a small crisis facility that actually did really well. And in the time that I worked with that, which I think was 2 or 3 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, Henry, like we worked so hard and we tried really hard to be family driven. And I'm not saying other places don't. We were small, we had up to 7 kids. And I think we only ever refused to take 2 children. One of those went on to, at the place where he went to a hospital and he actually killed someone there. So, he was pretty. And we did all kinds of things, like children from the detention center, we saw them there. I mean, we did all kinds of things. But to this, I still would recommend, would you say I'm describing that fairly, Henry?
Yes, you are.
Okay, and we never used restraint. We never used seclusion, and we saw hundreds of kids. So that was really successful for that model. But even there, and I remember Randy Hendricks was the head of the Department of Mental Health at the time, and he would take me all over with him to talk about it. But he would try to get me to stop saying what I wanted to say, because what I wanted to say is if we had it to do all over again, we wouldn't do it that way. We would look more at using like therapeutic foster care. For some of the youth who were like 16 and younger, for some of the older ones, working with them on, if they could be like stay somewhere else for a while instead of being in their home, and we could put enough supports around them in either setting, that's what we would do. Because even with something that was running really well with those youth put together, we had some of these same challenges. I don't think any of these things happened as far as I know, but it's still anytime you have youth together. And then residential treatment facilities often fail to effectively maintain connections between children and their communities and to plan for children's discharge to the community for ongoing care. And I know one thing that we're really vocal about, and I think I hope we're seeing with the work that we're doing, is, in Mississippi, we have a real opportunity to affect this because what's supposed to happen is MAP teams are supposed to, and this is in state law, serve as a single point of entry and reentry for children coming into the system of care. So children who have a serious emotional disturbance, or even if they haven't been diagnosed, are likely to have one, and are at risk for coming out of home, that's the place a family should be able to go, is the MAP team, and say, I really need help. Like when all this stuff is first starting. And then if children, and hopefully come up with a plan in collaboration with that MAP team to keep that child from needing residential placement. If they do need residential placement, what is supposed to happen according to state law is that MAP team, that the family or whoever that child's guardian is, can go to the MAP team, hopefully as soon as they're admitted to a residential treatment facility, and start working with them and say, this is what I need. And the child will be able to give input too when I come out, so that resident, so that I won't need to go back. That's a mechanism we already have in state law. I think it's underutilized, but that's a real opportunity we have here. And then RTFs often imply carceral technology, and that's basically means like the same type of technology that's used in jails with all the monitoring and the cameras and all that. So that creates environments that feel more like detention facilities than therapeutic settings. You can see why they're doing it, because they're trying to prevent these things from up here from happening, but just the nature of this kind of treatment creates this real dilemma of having almost these jail-like conditions and really, doing things that wouldn't happen to someone somewhere else as far as catching everything on camera and all that, or putting them in a situation where they might not be safe. So that's another challenge. Um, and that state and federal oversight authorities fail to effectively identify and address harm to children in residential treatment facilities. So all these things were going on and they found evidence of it. Now, again, we don't know if any of it was specific to Mississippi. But all these things happened, and these facilities, they were certified by their states. They had Joint Commission or CARF, but these things still happened. And then another thing they found is when residential treatment facilities were made to correct these deficiencies, typically what happened is let's just say there was an episode of abuse, they would correct that one situation, but not look at what's happening across that company. And a lot of these companies they all own more than one facility. What do we need to correct across our company? And then the last thing they found is exploiting corporate structures can enable residential treatment facility operators to evade oversight. And basically what that means is, there's all these things these company owners can do, like say sell part of the company, but still be involved in it, name it something else, and hire some of those same people. So one thing they found is that it was in the testimony very hard. Let's just say I'm a parent and I'm trying to find out, has any of this stuff happened at the facility where I'm thinking about my child going to? That is very hard to get that kind of information because it's not consistent from state to state how it's all tracked. There's not one place you can go look. And also the corporation, that we don't know if this has ever happened in Mississippi, but could have engaged in some of these things where, like maybe the same people are still there. They just made it look like it was a new place and called it something else. So those are some of the biggest things they found. Any thoughts about those? These are the recommendations they came up with, and I know you guys can read, but we'll just go over these. Just looking at this, the first most obvious thing is that the standards inside of residential treatment facilities must be raised. Now, it'd be really good to have fewer children in them. But for those that are there, making sure the standards are high and it's consistent, and that would be really helpful for families because they would know what they could expect. And just like in our state, we were like, well, this group certifies it and this group gives its license, but like, what does that mean? And where do people go? Where does a family go if they're concerned about the standards in a facility? And this is huge. Government funding should prioritize community-based services and placements. And one thing we would emphasize at Families as Allies, and I'll talk about some of these at the end, is that it prioritizes community-based services and placements that work. Because one thing we see over and over and over again, and I know we have therapists on here, and I'm a therapist, but is a lot of money going to more like traditional mental health services, and they might be delivered slightly differently, like saying you can do this in the home or whatever, but that may not be what that family needs. That may not be what's needed to keep that child in the home. And two big examples of that we see over and over and over and over again, and I'm not even sure if there's a way to fund these in Mississippi. One is help, like real practical help. Some of the biggest disruptions we see in crises, and these end up in crises for family, is that transition time, like a child coming home from school and it's time to do their homework, or it's time to go to bed, or it's time to get up, or it's time to get on the bus. And everything falls apart and becomes a crisis. If families had someone, and if these people exist and are routinely available, please let us know, where like they could call and and have someone come help their child ride the bus. Those kinds of things. I know sometimes that's done through community support. Really giving a lot, let's say it is homework time that starts making everything fall apart. Providing support during that time and maybe modeling some things that could then be transitioned, some strategies or techniques that can then be transitioned off to that family. Now, some of those things can be done in therapy, but and again, nobody's going to come to families as allies when they're getting the best services ever. They're going to tell us when things don't work. But one thing we see is too much reliance on kind of traditional let's sit down and talk therapy as opposed to those kinds of things. Same thing at school, too much reliance on pulling children out of classrooms and doing therapy. And then the child gets more and more behind and it's more and more frustrating, more likely to blow up, more likely to end up in out of home care. But if it was like community-based mental health consultation, where whoever's working with that child could work more with the school if the school wants it, instead of directly with that child to help set things up in the classroom so they worked better. Those are two huge things we think would help. And third, effective oversight mechanisms or residential treatment facilities require substantial investment at all levels. So there's going to have to be a lot of work on this, including by the states. And there's got to be families at every table and youth saying this is what needs to be looked for. And that doesn't mean writing it all up and then letting some families look at it. It means from the very beginning, youth and families who have been through this being at the table to redesign some of these things. So let's see. So raising standards, focus on community base. And these things would, if there's more oversight, that would improve more oversight that's going to compel providers to raise the bars on standards within RTFs. And then CMS and I always forget what ACF stands for, but it's basically child welfare, should work together to clarify and streamline federal oversight requirements for RTFs, like who's going to oversee what, and how do we make sure that's done accountably. Youth with lived experience have got to be guiding this, driving it. And this is huge. And this, I think, is an issue in Mississippi, increasing the awareness for judges on the risks of improper placements in residential treatment facilities. Because I do think, including in Mississippi, these children are sometimes court ordered to a facility because a youth court judge or a family court judge sincerely believes that's in their best interest. And the idea of instead of that, because it's not really, and I love all the youth court judges that we work with, but that's not really their area of expertise. And if instead there was an emphasis on maybe a court-ordered evaluation to see what would be the best treatment setting and what kinds of things in the community would most help them. And those two organizations can and should do more to prioritize spending on community-based behavioral health services. And again, that's going to have to include funding a much more flexible array of things, like some of the things I was talking about. And if those are fundable, you know, and I'm wrong, I would be thrilled. I want to be wrong, and I'm happy to correct that. And then that the Department of Justice should assess residential treatment facility placements for potential Olmstead violations. And that's what Mississippi got sued over in the mental health system. So that's looking at, is this child being inappropriately segregated from their peers, and have they been given every opportunity to live in the community if that's what they want? And then these accrediting bodies that we've talked about, like the Joint Commission, should closely monitor facilities following the discovery of non-compliance with requirements of elements, because they have a lot of control and influence over these facilities. So I brought up some of the things. I'll just tell you really quickly. Again, we think MAP teams could be much more utilized to help a lot of this, especially if all families knew when their child starts showing these kinds of problems and it looks like they're at risk for coming out of the home, they can go to the MAP team then. that might mean fewer children come into custody. And I think a lot of the children who are in residential treatment facilities are in state custody. That's one way we can start breaking that cycle way back there. So using MAP teams more, we have great support for wraparound facilitation in the state, but letting that function for those children with the highest need so that those informal kinds of supports, like I was just describing, can really and truly be available and paid for. Things like helping, almost like those homemaker type, I don't even know what you call it, but like the helping with homework, helping with those transition times, and then having more of a mental health consultation model in the schools to help with those school crises. I think those things would go an incredibly long way towards keeping children in the home from what we see from families. Um, and then using, when children do come out of the home, using those MAP teams to make absolutely sure every child coming out or of a residential treatment facility, that should be coordinated with the MAP team, and whoever the guardian is, the family or the guardian and the child should choose their services from wherever they want. And also looking at if therapeutic foster care could be used more broadly. It has, I think in this state, it tends to be used as almost like a mental health treatment, and the change agent is seen as those therapists that work for TFC. But if that can be seen as a more holistic treatment model for both children in and out of state custody, where they can get this intensive care that's led by the foster parents, very well trained foster parents who are working with that child and that child's biological family, to really help implement a comprehensive wraparound approach with any kind of services and supports that child needs. Finding a way where we can incorporate respite into those models. Those are some things just based on what we've seen over and over at Families as Allies that we think would help all this and would make the reliance on therapeutic or on residential treatment facilities less, and then looking at what needs to happen with those. So, and I know I said I wasn't going to talk the whole time, but I did. Do y'all have any, have just like a minute or two left. Do y'all have any thoughts or comments about all this? Or any recommendations? And there's a lot here. We didn't even talk about, there was legislation this past session that actually increases the beds for residential treatment facilities in our state, which is probably, and that legislation made me very nervous. This coming out with this report makes me even more nervous. So that's there's a lot of follow-up that needs to be done, but any thoughts or comments?
No comment. I will say in regards to the MAP teams, I'm finding more and more in my work with the community that a lot of people aren't even aware that they exist. And they are primarily seen as financial assistance to help pay a small bill, and not really seen as long-term assistance or an entry point. So I think maybe the awareness of that could be improved throughout the state. But I know, speaking with our local mental health facilities, that the marketing budgets just kind of keep getting smaller and smaller. And so it becomes harder and harder to kind of increase that awareness. I also want to agree with your point of in-home care. I think is going to be a lot more effective, because in these residential facilities, they're learning how to cope and things like that, but within this controlled environment. And the school that they're going to is not the same school that they're going to be returning to. And so they're not, while they're learning these skills, they're not truly learning how to implement them in real world situations and with their siblings. And the parents aren't usually getting any type of education if that's needed. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth there.
Those are all such good points. Yeah, because and the things that may be helping, we don't know if they'd still help in the environment they're actually going to be in. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right about the MAP teams. I think sometimes even some people on the MAP team are confused about what the MAP team is. They see it more as emergency assistance. Any other thoughts? And do any of my friends from Medicaid think that I said anything wrong? I'm always willing to talk about what others, like what other people are supposed to be doing. And there is information on at the end of that report. Let's see. And I don't know if the deadline's passed to give public comments. I'll have to look. And we're very happy to help with that process, including like things can be submitted. Like if someone doesn't have an email to submit them through, we can use like our info email, that type of thing. But anyway, I know we've gone over. Thank you. I really appreciate everyone being here. And we're happy, you know, you can contact us. We're happy to help. Okay, thanks you guys.